Who knows what cyanobacteria do? Does anybody?
They photosynthesize. They're responsible for like 50% of the Earth's oxygen, or at least the ones in the ocean.
Yeah. So cyanobacteria evolved, probably between 2 and 3 billion years ago. The oxygen that they produce, and of course, essentially chloroplasts in these plants over here are essentially glorified cyanobacteria that have been endosymbiotized over, hundreds of millions of years ago. And so these cyanobacteria play an important role in this ecosystem as kind of the primary producers. And they are able to tolerate very high temperatures compared to these plants over here, right? So if the water comes through here, all these plants die, but the microbes are more tolerant of that. And so what I did for my dissertation is I studied the UV or ultraviolet radiation impacts on cyanobacteria. Because of course, if you're photosynthetic, you gotta absorb light, but UV is not good for them any more than it is for us. And then for my postdoc, I studied more in terms of the diversity and distribution of microbes there. All right, so what I like to start with for this class, it is called Microbial Ecology, but let's start even before we get to micro. Can somebody define ecology for us? Now, this is where, oops. This is where I can,
Maybe it's the study of the environment where the bacteria or microbe is, like everything around it.
okay. So the study of the environment and where bacteria are, okay. I think it's Sierra, is that with your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to guess like the study of how organisms interact with their environment.
Uh-huh, okay. Anybody else have any thoughts? Those of you that have taken Bio 350, what did they teach you in Bio 350? Do you remember? Pretty much what's already been said. Environment, microbes, okay. Or in this case, environment, in that case, animals, plants, okay. So this was an early definition by Ernst Haeckel, who's attributed as one of the early ecologists, even though he would not have referred to himself as an ecologist at that point. It wasn't really a field of study. Is that the study of interactions between organisms and their environment, right? Okay. Then Eugene Krebs in the 70s came up with this sort of refinement. What's the key difference that you see in this definition? And how does that, why does that matter?
It's talking about the quantity, or like it, it talks more about the composition of the environment as compared to the definition on the top.
Okay, so quantity, because you see the word abundance. Does anybody else want to amplify that? Maybe somebody who hasn't said anything? Thank you for sharing.
I would say that I would look at this and think, what, opportune environments enable the abundance of organisms.
Okay. Yeah, so the distribution piece, is that kind of what you're getting at, Cecilia, in terms of the environment?
Yeah, so depending on the environment, it really determines the distribution of where organisms are.
Yeah, and we'll talk quite a bit about that during this semester. Thanks. All right, so if we're going to do this for microbes, how do we need to tweak these definitions? Anybody want to take a stab? Just stick my microbe or microorganism in front of it. Maybe we just put
How
microbe here.
microbes interact with each other,
Okay.
relationships.
So the study of how microorganisms interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right. Anybody else?
Maybe how organisms, microorganisms interact with each other, but how they how certain groups of organisms are in one area versus another area.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And so there's that distribution piece again, right? So absolutely. And so there's another researcher who was a microbiologist who again would not have considered himself a microbial ecologist. Oops. He said that it was the study of the relationship between the environmental conditions, as we've just said, and the special forms of life is what he was describing them, which of course meant microorganisms. But remember, at that point, we knew what microorganisms were, but we kind of didn't really have a full understanding. And then if you look at this as a textbook definition, the science that studies the relationship between microbes and their environment. So it's really, kind of very reminiscent of some of these up here. All right. So in terms of these differences, obviously there's a difference in size between one kind of organism and macroorganisms, right? But what are some other fundamental differences you guys can think of in terms of their distribution, their abundance, their interaction with the environments, or other aspects of their life cycle? What are some things we need to think about? Like if we were to look at a general ecology textbook, what are some things that might not apply or might apply differently in a microbial context?
For microbes, they reproduce a lot faster than other organisms in their environment.
Okay, so reproductive rates can be much faster. Okay, we'll talk about that. Although they often are not as fast out in nature as they are in a test tube, but they're definitely going to reproduce in some cases much faster than, say, an elephant or an oak tree. All right, anything else?
The sheer number of organisms present.
Okay, so there's an enormous number of microbes. Okay. Getting back to reproduction, is there anything else that we need to worry about or think about?
No gender.
Say again, please.
There's no gender difference, like
There's no gender. Somebody take that to the next step.
One is like asexually reproduced and the other is sexually reproduced typically.
Exactly, right? So does that affect their ecology or maybe their evolution in some way? How would it affect their evolution? If you're asexual, do you evolve the same as a sexual organism?
No, it's slower.
Sexual selection.
Well, there's definitely not going to be sexual selection, right? So no like showy feathers and things like that. But I think somebody said it might be slower for microbes.
Yes, because there's no diversity unless there's mutation rates or conjugation of some sort.
Okay, so there's not sexual recombination, right? Is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
So without that, that's one source of diversity. But I will say that there's more diversity in microbes than there are in macroorganisms. And we'll talk later in the course about how that has come to be, despite the limitation that you aptly bring up. And of course, mutations are going to play a role. And horizontal transfer, or as you mentioned, conjugation, which is one form of that, also plays a role. So Cool. So we definitely have covered some of the differences. And so one of these fundamental differences is asexuality versus sexuality, right? And I will point out that when all of the theories were developed by macroecologists, they developed them for eukaryotes. So how we apply those to microbes can be a little bit tricky. Now, there are sexual eukaryotes as well, microbial eukaryotes, but a big focus of this class will be on bacteria and archaea. We will talk a little bit about unicellular algae at times, but we're not really focusing on eukaryotes as much. So they also make defining key terms in ecology like species and niche very problematic. And we're going to define that later, but does anybody want to touch on species? Who remembers your general biology? How do we define species for like an animal?
Like individuals that can reproduce with one another.
That's right. That produce offspring that are also reproductive, right? So if you're asexual, does that definition work? Not really, right? So if you're asexual, you know, you're not gonna take two bacillus and put them together and ask, are they the same species? Because you put them in a flask together and see if they have sex, right? They may exchange genes, and we'll talk about horizontal gene transfer later, but they're not going to have sex in the same way that we think of for eukaryotes. And then there's this concept of the niche or niche, which hopefully you guys have heard before. Does anybody have a good definition for an ecological niche that you have learned in other classes? Maybe you remember. Well, we'll talk about this in this class, but basically this is kind of the way of describing what organisms are doing and how they're interacting with others. So it's a very fundamental concept in ecology. The other thing to note is that macroecology often just dumps microbes into a black box. So let's say, oh, look, we have these animals and we have these plants, and then, oh, maybe we have microbes in the soil and they're doing stuff. They're cycling things. They're doing stuff, decomposing things, right? But they don't identify those organisms to the same degree as they would the animals or the plants. So, and it's understandable because it's not their focus, but it will be the focus. So these are some of the key questions in microbial ecology, right? And you'll see these are very basic questions, right? Question? Sarah, do you have a question?
Well, I was wondering if like we could say that macro ecology is like dependent on microecology and not vice versa, or if that's incorrect.
Well, it is kind of a two-way street. Although I can tell you this, if you wiped out every animal and plant on our Earth, right, the microbes would just keep on going. Some of them would die, right, that are obligate symbionts or pathogens, right? So the COVID viruses would not do very well, right? But there would be other coronaviruses that infect microbes or whatever that do just fine, right? I can't say the same for us. If we lost every microbe off this planet, we'd all die as well. So it is, that said though, you know, there is a lot of interaction in both directions that can be mutually beneficial. So, but yes, that's a good point. So in terms of these key questions, some of these seem really basic, but as I mentioned earlier, it can be really hard to answer these. And so we're going to attempt to learn how we do that. How do we know who's there in that pinch of dirt from the front of your, you know, yard? What are they doing? How are they interacting with each other is really challenging. You can't see the lion killing the gazelle or whatever like you'd see in, you know, National Geographic or whatever, right? These sort of classical ecological interactions that make you say, oh, that's predation, right? Are there microbial predators? Well, yes, there are, and we're going to talk about that later in the class, but they're much harder to see. All right, so the last little bit, I know we're running out of time here, is just kind of an overview. You know, many of you have had this in like a general micro class for the micro majors. You know, early on, microbiology was discovered when we developed microscopes. And of course, people like Antony van Leeuwenhoek and Robert Hooke played an important role in that, using very, what we'd call today, primitive devices, but something like this, but allowing them to see. And that was in the late 17th century, hundreds of years ago. Okay. But environmental micro or microbial ecology really didn't happen for decades or centuries after that. And so in the late 19th century, there were some people like that guy Beyerink I mentioned earlier, who's Dutch. There's a German, Vinogradsky. And what they did is they were growing things using things like feeding them nitrogen, sulfur, these kinds of things, essentially using media to ask ecological questions, even though they didn't really know they were asking that. Okay, they were looking to see about specific metabolic pathways without even really knowing what they were up to. So this Beyerink guy actually founded a school, a sort of research lineage, and he had his students and sort of scientific progeny went on, and many of them came to the US, which may or may not have something to do with the fact that Beyerink apparently, by all accounts, was a real jerk. He was not a nice man, but a very good scientist, apparently. But so many of these folks came and ended up at some of the top universities like Stanford and Harvard. So microbial ecology really didn't come into being until the late 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s and 90s, we developed some simple molecular approaches, and we're going to talk a lot more about this later. And then really in the 2000s, we now are using omics approaches to study, and this has revolutionized our ability to understand the complexity of microbes. So we're going to learn a lot about these approaches in the second part of the class. And that is all I have to say. Are there any questions in our last minute that we have here? So I saw Victor set up a Discord stream for you guys already. So great. You guys, feel free to share. Obviously, you're not going to be using Discord to share during our exam, but I'm more than happy for you to be using Discord to share information and learning during the course of the class. Any questions about anything I talked about today or about the course or how we're setting things up? If not, we will see you guys next Monday. And as I said, if any of you have any special things you need to talk with me about, please feel free to stay on and we can chat. Or if you need to set a different time to come to office hours, that'll work too.